autumn, on the banks of a river called Siniuka, somewhere near the modern Ukrainian town of Torovitsia. According to later Lithuanian chronicles, thousands of horsemen are watching each other across an open field. On one side, a Tatar cavalry force loyal to the Golden Horde, the western arm of an empire that had, for over a century, made princes across Eastern Europe kneel and pay tribute in silver, fur, and grain. On the other, an army of Lithuanians and Ruthenians, arranged, the chronicles claim, into 6 divisions curved into the shape of a crescent. Dust rises, horses shift their weight. Somewhere in that line stands Grand Duke Algirdas of Lithuania, a man who has spent nearly 3 decades building an empire quietly, one river valley at a time, while everyone else was watching Moscow. What happens next, if the old accounts are even half accurate, will end 100 years of Mongol dominance over one of the richest regions in Eastern Europe. It should be as famous as the battles you already know. It isn't. Most people who can tell you exactly what happened at Kulikovo Field in 1380 have never heard of Blue Waters, a battle that, if it unfolded the way Lithuanian sources say it did, came almost 20 years earlier and dealt the Golden Horde one of its first major defeats on European soil. So why has it nearly vanished from memory? Here's the honest answer before we go any further. We're not entirely sure this battle looked the way later writers claimed it did. The oldest surviving record doesn't even mention a fight. The detailed version, the crescent formation, the 6 divisions, the crossbowmen on the flanks, comes from a source written more than 2 centuries after the fact. So, this isn't going to be a story where we hand you numbers and call them facts. It's going to be an investigation. We'll walk through what the earliest sources actually say, what later chroniclers added and why, and what the terrain, the timing, and the political chaos inside the Mongol world tell us about whether this victory could really have changed the map of Eastern Europe forever. To understand why 2 armies were standing on that riverbank at all, we have to go back 3 years, to the moment an empire that had terrified all of Europe began quietly tearing itself apart. In 1359, the Khan of the Golden Horde, a ruler named Berdy Beg, died. On its own, that sentence sounds unremarkable. Khans died. Empires survived it. But the Golden Horde was not built like the kingdoms of Western Europe, with tidy rules of succession passed from father to son. It was a steppe empire, descended from the armies of Genghis Khan a century earlier, and its stability depended on one thing above all else, a single line of Khans strong enough that nobody dared challenge them. Berdy Beg's death broke that spell. There was no obvious heir with enough authority to hold the whole structure together, and once that authority cracked, every regional governor, every ambitious general, every distant relative with a claim to Genghis Khan's bloodline suddenly had a reason to reach for the throne. What followed is a period historians now call the Great Troubles, nearly 2 decades, from 1359 into the 1380s, during which the Golden Horde tore through Khan after Khan, rival after rival, in a rolling civil war that no single faction could win outright. The empire that had once sent unified armies deep into Poland, Hungary, and the Russian principalities began fracturing into separate power bases, each one called an ulus, each one increasingly answering to nobody but itself. Picture a machine so large and so feared that entire nations built their foreign policy around avoiding its attention, and now picture that same machine, quietly, from the inside, starting to grind against itself. For the rulers who had spent generations paying tribute to the Horde, watching this unfold must have felt like watching a storm cloud that refuses to break. Nobody could be certain the chaos would last. Nobody could be certain it wouldn't. And if you were a neighboring prince weighing whether to test the Horde's weakened grip, you were making a bet, because if the empire pulled itself back together while you were still exposed on its border, the retaliation would be brutal. One ruler, however, had been making exactly that bet for years, long before the throne in Sarai ever destabilized. Grand Duke Algirdas of Lithuania was not the kind of leader who announced his ambitions with dramatic declarations. He built his empire the way a careful player builds a position on a board, patiently, one acquisition at a time, always choosing targets that were valuable but not yet strong enough to fight back. By the late 1350s, years before Blue Waters, Algirdas had already absorbed most of the old Principality of Chernigov, including its capital at Bryansk, quietly folding Ruthenian lands into Lithuanian control, while larger powers were looking elsewhere. This wasn't a man who gambled on sudden opportunities. This was a man who had been positioning himself for this exact moment for a very long time. And at the center of that positioning sat one city that neither the Golden Horde nor Lithuania was willing to fully give up: Kiev. Once the beating heart of the medieval Rus's world, Kiev, by the mid-14th century, existed in an uncomfortable arrangement historians describe as a condominium, shared, uneasy, and unstable. Lithuanian influence had crept into the city decades earlier, after a clash on the Irpin River back in the early 1320s. But Kiev still paid its tribute to the Horde, still answered, at least on paper, to Mongol authority. It belonged to both empires and to neither. And an arrangement like that can only last as long as both sides are too weak, too distracted, or too cautious to force the issue. That's exactly what was about to change. On one side of this equation, the Golden Horde was staring inward, consumed by a leadership crisis with no end in sight, desperate to hold its own capital together while its western frontier sat undefended. On the other side, Algirdas was staring outward, watching Kiev, watching Podolia, watching a Black Sea coastline he had never been able to reach, and wondering how long this window would stay open. Neither side had a full picture of what the other was thinking. The Horde was betting that no regional power would dare test them, while succession chaos was, in their minds, a temporary internal matter. Algirdas was betting that this chaos would last just long enough for him to strike, consolidate, and be gone before anyone in Sarai could organize a response. Both calculations sounded reasonable from where each side was standing. Only one of them was about to be proven right, and the battlefield, when it finally arrived, would not be kind to whichever prince had misjudged the moment. If you're finding this rivalry between a crumbling steppe empire and a patient forest kingdom as fascinating as we do, consider subscribing. This channel exists to dig into exactly these forgotten turning points, the ones that reshaped continents but somehow never made it into the popular version of history. By 1362, Algirdas had made his decision. The Golden Horde's Crimean Ulus, the regional authority technically responsible for defending Podolia and the surrounding steppe, was tied up in its own internal war, fighting to influence events at New Sarai, the Horde's capital on the Volga. That meant the western frontier, the very lands Algirdas needed to secure Kiev permanently, was, for the first time in generations, essentially undefended. This was not a door left slightly open. This was a door left wide open, and Algirdas knew exactly how long a window like that tends to stay that way. What followed was not a single sudden strike. It was a campaign, unfolding over months, methodical in a way that reveals how deliberately Algirdas had planned this. He marched his army south and east from Lithuania's core territory, through Volhynia, where established roads and existing Lithuanian influence eased the movement of thousands of men and horses. From there, he moved to secure whatever remained of the old Principality of Chernigov that hadn't already fallen under his control in previous years. Then his forces struck an unidentified fortress called Korshev, somewhere in the upper reaches of a river feeding the Don, a target so obscure that modern historians still argue about its exact location. From there, it's believed Algirdas pushed further, absorbing territory that had once belonged to the old Principality of Pereyaslav, land that fell, on paper, under Crimean authority, but authority that no longer had the manpower to respond. Finally, as autumn set in, the army turned west, crossing the Dnieper River and marching into Podolia open steppe country, the kind of terrain that had belonged for over a century to Mongol horsemen and almost no one else. Understand what this sequence actually tells you. This was not a raiding party looking for quick plunder. This was a rolling annexation, fortress by fortress, principality by principality, each step calculated to secure territory before pushing toward the next objective. And it explains something crucial about why terrain and timing mattered so much here. Podolia is steppe and forest steppe, country flat, open, made for fast cavalry, exactly the kind of ground where Mongol horse archers had dominated every army in Europe for over 100 years. Algirdas wasn't just marching into contested land. He was marching straight into the one type of terrain where his enemy held every historical advantage. Autumn brought its own gamble. On one hand, the season meant fresh harvests, which made feeding an army on the march considerably easier. Grain stores full, livestock fattened, supply lines shorter than they would be in winter or the lean months before a new harvest. On the other hand, autumn in Eastern Europe means the weather is turning, days shortening, temperatures dropping, and an army marching hundreds of kilometers from home has to move fast enough to reach its objective before conditions worsen and morale along with them. The two forces converging on that Podolian steppe could not have looked more different. Algirdas commanded a mixed army of Lithuanian and Ruthenian troops, heavy cavalry and infantry equipped in the European style, armed with spears and swords built for close, disciplined combat, supported by crossbow units capable of punching through armor at range, though slower to reload than a bow. The Tatar forces defending Podolia relied almost entirely on light cavalry, mobile, fast, and built around mounted archery, a style of warfare that had terrorized static, slow-moving European armies for generations by simply refusing to stand still and fight on anyone else's terms. On open ground, against a disorganized enemy, that kind of cavalry was nearly unbeatable. Against a formation that refused to break and refused to chase, its advantages started to look a lot less certain. Standing against Algirdas were three local Tatar lords governing Podolia in the Horde's name, men whose authority rested entirely on a system that was currently falling apart behind them. They had no reinforcements coming. New Sarai was consumed by its own war. Whatever force they could muster from their own territory was, by definition, everything they had. There would be no second army marching to relieve them. If this went badly, and every decision they made in the days ahead would have to be made with that reality hanging over them. We don't have a reliable, detailed record of what either army actually said or felt the night before contact. No diary, no first-hand account survives from Podolia in the autumn of 1362. But we do know how armies like this operated in this period, and we can imagine, cautiously, what that night might have carried. Cook fires scattered across open ground, horses tethered and restless, men on both sides, running through a plan that felt solid in daylight and considerably less certain once the sun went down. Somewhere in that darkness, three Tatar commanders were weighing a choice that steppe cavalry had faced for generations, whether to meet an approaching force head-on or fall back, harass, and wear the enemy down the way Mongol armies had done to invaders for over 100 years. They chose to stand and fight. It's a decision that made sense on its own terms. Retreating without a battle would have meant abandoning Podolia's authority without a single show of resistance, a political cost that local rulers, desperate to preserve what legitimacy they had left, could not easily accept. But choosing a direct confrontation against a disciplined, prepared enemy, instead of relying on the mobility and harassment tactics that had made steppe cavalry so dangerous for a century, was also a gamble. one that assumed their traditional advantages would hold up against a formation Algirdas had apparently built specifically to counter them. Every piece was now in position. The terrain, the timing, the two very different armies, the desperate calculations on both sides, all of it had been building toward this single stretch of riverbank. And whatever each side believed about their own strengths walking into that morning, the battlefield was about to test those assumptions in a way neither commander could fully control. Before we step onto that field, quick question for you. If you were commanding those 3 Tatar lords, with no reinforcements coming and an enemy army already inside your territory, would you hold your ground or retreat and live to fight another day? Drop hold or retreat in the comments. Now, let's see what they actually chose to do and whether it worked. The two armies came within sight of each other on the open ground near what would later be called Blue Waters. According to the fullest surviving account of the battle, a description written by the Polish historian Maciej Strykowski in 1582, more than 2 centuries after the fact, and one modern historians treat with real caution, Algirdas had organized his forces into 6 divisions, arranged in a wide crescent, a half-circle open toward the approaching enemy. If that description is accurate, it wasn't a formation built for a quick, decisive charge. It was built to receive one. The Tatar cavalry held every advantage that had defined a century of steppe warfare, speed, mobility, and the mounted archer's ability to strike from a distance and vanish before the enemy could close the gap. As they approached, they opened with what had always worked before: a barrage of arrows aimed into the flanks of the Lithuanian line, a tactic meant to soften formations, break morale, and create gaps before any horse ever crossed into melee range. It was the same approach that had shattered heavier, slower European armies for generations. This time, it didn't work the way it was supposed to. The Lithuanian and Ruthenian troops held their positions. According to the Chronicle account, the arrows caused little real damage to a formation that had been built deliberately to absorb exactly this kind of opening assault. And that single detail matters more than it might seem. Mounted archery is devastating against loose or disorganized troops, against soldiers who break formation to chase or flee. It is far less effective against a disciplined line that simply stands its ground and waits. If the Tatar commanders had planned their opening move around the assumption that fear and disorder would do the work for them, that assumption was the first thing to crack. With the arrow assault failing to break the Lithuanian formation, Algirdas's infantry began to move heavy troops armed with spears and swords advancing directly into contact, pressing forward against the Tatar front line in the kind of close, grinding combat. That light cavalry, built for speed and distance, was never designed to withstand for long. This was the moment the battle's character started to shift. What had opened as a contest of mobility versus discipline was becoming a contest of raw endurance at close range. And endurance was not where Tatar cavalry traditionally won its fights. Then came the move that, if the chronicle is even roughly accurate, decided everything. Units under the command of Algirdas's nephews, the sons of a Lithuanian noble named Karigotas, leading troops from the Lithuanian stronghold of Naugardukas, swung around and struck the Tatar flanks with crossbows. Think about what that meant for a cavalry force built entirely around freedom of movement. The crescent formation Algirdas had set up wasn't just a shield against the initial arrow storm, it was a trap slowly closing. As the flanking units pressed in from the sides, the open space the Tatar horsemen needed to maneuver, to wheel away, to regroup and strike again from a new angle, began disappearing. For light cavalry, losing room to maneuver is not a minor inconvenience. It is close to fatal. Their entire tactical identity depends on space, space to charge, space to retreat, space to circle back and strike from an unexpected direction. Trap that kind of force against a static front line with no room to break outward, and you've taken away the one advantage that made them dangerous in the first place. According to the Chronicle, That is precisely what happened. The Tatar formation, unable to hold together under pressure from the front and flanks at once, began to fracture. What came next moved fast. Once a cavalry line built for mobility loses its shape, it doesn't fall apart slowly. It collapses almost all at once, because every rider suddenly realizes the only path left open is backward. The three Tatar commanders, watching a defense built on speed and distance get pinned down and ground apart at close range, would have understood in that moment that the battle they had planned for was not the battle they were now fighting. Whatever hope remained of holding the line, of forcing a standoff that bought time for reinforcements that were never coming anyway, evaporated as the formation broke. The retreat that followed was not organized. According to the surviving account, the Tatar force scattered into disorderly flight, and Algirdas's army, having absorbed the opening assault and broken the enemy's cohesion, pressed the advantage. We don't have reliable numbers for how many men fought on either side that day, and we don't have a trustworthy casualty count. No chronicle preserves one, and every modern figure you might see quoted online is speculation dressed up as fact. What we do have is a clear outcome, a defensive formation, patiently built and deliberately designed to counter a century-old style of steppe warfare, held long enough to turn the enemy's greatest strength into the very thing that destroyed them. By the time the dust began to settle over that stretch of riverbank, the political map of a vast stretch of Eastern Europe had already started to shift, even if none of the exhausted men still standing on that field could have known just how far those changes would reach. When the noise faded, what was left was mostly silence, and the kind of aftermath that rarely makes it into dramatic retellings of medieval battles. No precise casualty figures, no detailed lists of the dead. The chronicles simply don't preserve that information, and we won't pretend otherwise. What the sources do make clear is the political outcome, and that outcome was immediate. Whatever authority the three Tatar lords had held over Podolia in the Golden Horde's name effectively ended on that field. The record doesn't tell us the individual fate of each commander. We won't invent details. The sources don't support, but their power in the region did not survive the battle. Algirdas moved quickly to convert this military outcome into permanent political control. He advanced into Kiev and installed his own son, Vladimir, to govern the city directly, closing the door on the uneasy, divided authority that had defined Kiev's status for decades. No longer a city caught between two masters, paying tribute in two directions at once, Kiev now belonged to Lithuania, fully and openly, for the first time since Mongol influence had first reached the Dnieper. Podolia itself was handed to Algirdas's nephews, the same sons of Karajotas whose crossbow units had reportedly broken the Tatar flanks. It's a detail worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells you this campaign was never purely a military exercise. The men who fought the flanking action were the same men rewarded with the land afterward, proof that Algirdas had planned this expansion as a family enterprise from the beginning, war and inheritance moving together in a single calculated stroke. The shockwaves reached further than Podolia. To the south, the Principality of Moldavia, under a ruler named Bogdan, saw an opportunity in the Horde's collapsing authority and moved to end its own dependence on Mongol tribute, aligning itself instead with Lithuania's rising influence in the region. And to the north and east, Lithuania now found itself standing directly against a new neighbor it had never bordered before. The Grand Duchy of Moscow, itself quietly growing in strength, watching this expansion with an interest that would shape the rivalry between these two powers for generations to come. The battlefield itself, whatever violence had actually unfolded there, went quiet within days. But the consequences it set in motion did not stay contained to that riverbank. A city that had spent decades belonging to no one fully now belonged to someone entirely. A frontier region that had answered, however loosely, to Mongol authority for over a century, now answered to Lithuanian nobles instead. And an empire that had once been feared from Hungary to the Volga had just lost, in a single autumn campaign, one of the wealthiest borderlands it had left. The battlefield could fall silent. The map of Eastern Europe could not. So what did any of this actually change? And why does a battle you'd never heard of before this video deserve to sit alongside the ones you already know? Start with the most immediate answer. Lithuania, in the space of a single campaign, transformed itself from a regional power hemmed in by forests and rivers into a state that controlled a vast stretch of what is now Ukraine, with direct access to the Black Sea for the first time in its history. The Golden Horde, meanwhile, lost permanent influence over territory it had held, in one form or another, for over 100 years, territory it would never fully reclaim. There's a broader lesson buried in this story, and it's one worth carrying with you past the battlefield. The Golden Horde didn't lose Podolia because a stronger army showed up to take it. It lost Podolia because 2 decades of leadership crisis had already hollowed the empire out from the inside, and Algirdas simply had the patience to wait for the right moment to walk through the door that internal collapse had left open. Power, built on fear, can look unshakable right up until the moment its foundation cracks. And when it does, the collapse often has less to do with the enemy at the gates than with the rot that had already been spreading within. There's also a sharper tactical lesson hiding in what happened on that riverbank, one that echoes far beyond the 14th century. Raw advantage means very little without room to use it. Mongol-like cavalry had terrorized Europe for 100 years because it almost always fought on ground and in formations that let its speed and mobility dictate the terms of every engagement. At Blue Waters, if the chronicle is right, that advantage was neutralized not by a stronger force, but by a smarter one. A formation built specifically to absorb the opening strike, and then close the space an enemy like this needed to survive. And here's where most people get this story wrong, if they've heard it at all. The popular version of who finally broke Mongol power in Eastern Europe almost always starts and ends with Moscow, with Dmitry Donskoy, with the Battle of Kulikovo Field in 1380. That story isn't false, but it's incomplete. Nearly 2 decades earlier, a Lithuanian Grand Duke had already dealt the Golden Horde one of its first major territorial losses to a European power, and the reasons that victory faded from popular memory have almost nothing to do with what actually happened on the battlefield. Russian historians, understandably, had every reason to center Moscow's later triumph. Polish historians, for their own political reasons tied to later disputes over Podolia, had little interest in reinforcing Lithuania's claim to that land. Between those two competing silences, an entire battle nearly disappeared. Centuries later, if you stood on the banks of the Siniuka River today, you would find an ordinary stretch of Ukrainian countryside, quiet fields, a slow-moving river, nothing to mark the ground where, according to the old chronicles, an empire that had once made all of Eastern Europe tremble began its long retreat from these lands. No monument tells you what allegedly happened here. No plaque explains why this quiet field might belong in the same conversation as Kulikovo, as Agincourt, as the battles that actually make it into the history books people read. Maybe that's the real story behind this one, not just what happened on that riverbank in 1362, but how easily history decides which victories get remembered and which ones get left to fade into the grass. If this kind of story, the forgotten turning point, the empire that collapsed from within, the battle that history almost lets slip away, is the kind of history you want more of, that's exactly what this channel is built around. Consider subscribing if this helped you see a piece of the past you hadn't encountered before. And if you're curious how these threads connect, we've got more forgotten campaigns and imperial collapses waiting for you. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.